Starting. Hey, and we're live.
I'm live. Hey, Paul Bond, how are you?
All right, how's it going?
Very good. So this is our first episode of wire160, which will be, we'll probably do anywhere from 45 to 50 episodes over the course of the next semester. I hope you're ready for that, Paul. This is going to be part of the section of DS106 we're teaching, where we'll be using wire as our kind of textual touchstone throughout the semester. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a little kind of discussion of each of the episodes that we asked you to watch. And one of the things we're going to be doing and starting early is most of season one happened before the class even gets going. And we'll be discussing the episodes of season one and kind of setting up the discussion. These discussions will not be summaries of the episodes. We're expecting that you've watched the episode before you watch these. So if you haven't watched the episode, in particular the target, which is episode 1 of The Wire, you should stop this video now. We should have a little graphic. Stop this video now. And go watch it. And when you come back, I think a lot of what we talk about makes sense. We'll be discussing a series of themes, some of the aesthetic choices that they have made, building it, and kind of starting to make the argument over the next series of episodes that we discuss about kind of intentionality, aesthetics, and what's going on. So that's kind of an overview, Paul. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Some of the storytelling elements we'll be looking at, specifically design, photography, are things we're going to be working with in the course. The use of sound also plays into it, so we'll be talking about that at some point. In this first episode, we've got some really good examples of design and photography that tie into that. So.
Yeah, I do. And what we're going to do is we're going to jump into just the themes, and also keeping in mind we're going to do a few of these a week, so we're going to limit these to no longer than 20 minutes. So there'll be 20-minute short episodes discussing each episode of The Wire, and then another one will come out either a day or 2 days. So that's how we'll be pacing it. So let's jump in. We're talking about the first episode, The Target, and before I came on to talk with you about this, Paul, under your recommendation, I have the whole DVD series, which will be on loan in the UMW library and out there for other people to get a variety of ways. I listened to the commentary track on the first DVD. So a lot of what I'll be talking about, I'm sure we'll be going back and forth, is actually David Simon, the creator of the series and the writer of many of the episodes, talking about his kind of vision. So this isn't even like, do we believe the author intended this? Actually, we know. I mean, he lays it down pretty clearly, like there is authorial intention around many of these kind of questions. And to get us started, one of the things he talked about from the beginning is this idea of masking the kind of broader themes, the social themes that he wanted to get at, in the form of a cop show. And I was struck by that, because one of the things I often hear about is, oh, it's just another cop show. Right? Someone had even criticized, oh, another testosterone-driven cop show that was part of DS106. And in fact, that's part of what I think Simon is playing off of, or playing with, like using the kind of the tried and true genre of a cop show to say something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's really social commentary, like what's going on in society in America today, and over the course of the different seasons, what's going on in the streets, in the schools, in business,
City
in the
Hall.
press,
Yeah.
all that stuff. Yeah, that's going on in there. But the overarching theme that's pulling it all together is this police action that's going on, which sells it to the crowd, but it's not really what it's about.
Yeah. But I think it does take you, it does take a few episodes as a warning to get into that, because, the cop show, it really does play itself as a cop show, even though it's subverting the notions of a kind of typical cop show. It is playing off that aesthetic. And so there's some interesting choices. And like you said, season 2 is not about the cops. It's about, the docks and labor. And season 3 is about City Hall. And season 4 is about education. And season 5 is about journalism. So they're playing off different institutions. But at the beginning, a few episodes in, you might be like, oh no, just another cop show like X, Y, and Z. But it's not. So I really like that play that they're kind of doing. And one of the things he said in the commentary, and I'll pull it up now, is, he not only kind of suggests that it's like a cop show and that's a way in, and crime is a major genre that defines who we are as a society right now, but he plays off the aesthetics of that. And even right away in episode 1 of season 1, there's a scene where Detective Griggs and her two kind of like, I want to smash heads policemen underneath her, or I guess they're sergeants or waiting to be sergeants, are doing a street bust. And it shows all the adrenaline of a street bust that you would see in a typical cop show or whatever, but with none of the, there's no payoff. Let's watch this really quickly, because I think it does a really good job of kind of getting at that idea of the emptiness behind something.
I don't want no friendships. Hands behind your head. Oh, get your hands up. Get the other hand around the corner. Take the keys out. Drop the keys out of the car. Flip them down. Drop them. Get out of the car. Get down right here. Right here. Get down. Passenger, put your hands out of the car window. Both hands out of the car window. Use your right hand. Open up the car door. Slowly. Step out of the car. Step out of the car. Down on the ground. Down on the ground.
That's it. Take his man to jail.
You got a car? I got it. Look at this shit. Cross your legs. This.
You see what he did? Do you see what he did? Why he gonna go to my car like that? Shit gon' scratch the paint.
Stay in the car.
Tell him leave my car be. Stay in the fucking car. Shit just ain't right.
What you doing with something like that? Huh? You got it. I ain't seen when this bitch was looking at me, Kima. Ugly little fuck almost shit his pants. He was so scared. Right? Two guns. Remember? Two. So go keep it easy.
I mean, it's an interesting scene, and one of the things that Simon said, a couple of things that Simon said that struck me. There's no music.
Yeah.
Choice. There's no music that builds the tension. It's just the adrenaline of the cops going around, and that's a similar aesthetic you see a lot on TV, like adrenaline. But usually there's some big boss, or there's some kind of abject situation you find yourself in. No, this is not it at all. Tension is kind of manufactured. He's playing with that aesthetic. The sounds are all sighted, right? They're all coming from something, like a window or the car. And I just love that Simon says they thought a lot about sound, but sound in the real situation. And every time they had a sound, they sighted it within the scene, which I love. And the third part of it that I'm kind of fascinated by, and I think that's very interesting to me, is the way in which the actual tension and the scene of this big bust has no real bearing on anything else in the show. It just kind of establishes an aesthetic that almost The Wire is reacting against. It's trying to discount as a kind of a certain amount of propaganda played out on TV to kind of reinforce this kind of what they call these rips, right? This kind of community policing that really gets discounted throughout the show. So I mean, just as an early up, this idea of The Wire as a cop show is a total front. Because it's not a cop show, right?
It's showing like the adrenaline, the authoritarian control of the situation among the two like male cops, and then Greg's the woman like walks up and deflates the whole situation by finding the gun that these guys just ignored. You know.
I love it. And I mean, for me, that was just one of the things question to ask: is The Wire a cop show? And, for all intents and purposes, it is, but it's not your average cop show. And it's gonna provide you something different, different meditation. And I think the next scene that kind of gets at that a little bit is when you have, kind of quote unquote the star or the lead actor for at least season 1. It's Jimmy McNulty. And Jimmy McNulty comes into contact with his commanding officer, Major Rawls. And Rawls is pissed off. And Rawls is always pissed off, and he's pissed off at Jimmy right now. And so this is a scene, it's a pretty short scene where Rawls and Jimmy are going at it. So I'll bring this one up, and we'll take a look at that in relationship to a following scene, which I think is an interesting comparison. So let's take a look at this real quick. So this is Jimmy and Rawls talking in their office.
I got the deputy asking about 10. He only did 10. We only charged him for 3. You're full of shit. Sir, you can check the files. Maurice Scroggins, Tory Boyd, Roland Leggett. What's the name? The girl they found in the stairwell in Saratoga, Colette something or other. Major, these guys are real. They beat me up on the Gerard boat case just like they did Barlow.
Scroggins? I don't have an ace file on Scroggins.
He was last year, summer. 2 in the back of the head, Low Rice Courtyard.
Let me understand something. You were having the deputy bust my balls over a prior year case. Is this what I need from you, you insubordinate little fuck?
Yeah, and I guess we should mention that the profanity is going to be throughout.
Yeah, relentless profanity.
Yeah. And Rawls will be all about profanity. And he makes the case why there is so much profanity, because if you work with the Baltimore Police Department like he did as David Simon did as a journalist, that's how people talk. That's what they said. That was the kind of the sense of realism that he was trying to communicate. But there's a couple of things he said about the scene that I want to throw at you. One is the index cards. And another one is they're talking about murders that they're trying to solve. Right? And in the commentary, I thought David Simon said something really interesting about the scene. He talked about, you're reducing murders to index cards. And you have this statistical suggestion of success. Like, the greater the clearance, the better the job you're doing. The lower the clearance, the worse. With no real discussion of the fact that Baltimore at that time you had over 300 murders. And they all became simply a statistic that you had to kind of somehow manage around. This idea of comp stack that comes up later in the series was from the very beginning. And this subtle design of this, the index cards, which wasn't giving that away, but I love how Simon suggests how that's what it's related to. Really?
Yeah, he brings up the point that most of these murders happen in neighborhoods that don't matter so much to society at large.
Yeah.
No
political, there's no real political capital in any of them.
Yeah, it's all happening in the poor areas among poverty, and that doesn't get people elected. It doesn't drive businesses,
right.
So it's less of an issue. So they're just index cards.
And the other thing that's interesting there is the design. You brought this up a few times in your post about this. The design of the office in which they're talking. It's completely corporate, kind of like insurance cubicles, right, with that kind of faded frosty glass, and this real sense of the kind of institutional nature of these conversations, and how institutions can reduce everything to a statistic or to data or to results, and just how perfidious that is, and how all of us, in some ways, across this entire series have to deal with it. I found that really compelling. That again is so.
That the office is just it's just a cubicle farm. it's just a job. It's not, you know, cops and robbers justice. It's they could be salesmen, right? Or telemarketers even.
That's exactly. I mean, they could be talking about an investment, right? Like, we're going to get a yield on this or not? Like, are we invading this, drug sting to get a yield on our murders or not? And that kind of pushing forth. And then how much work will it be? You realize the question of labor for a lot of these people climbing the corporate ladder or the institutional ladder or the career ladder. That's a big question that comes up. Is how much am I willing to invest to do that? And let's take Rawls and Jimmy and show how maybe Simon and The Wire more generally is very intentional with its aesthetics, right? Because just a few scenes later, you have the one of the greatest characters of season one, D'Angelo Barksdale, who's the one who's freed or gets off the murder charge, and the kingpin, the drug kingpin, Avon Barksdale, talking in a very similar, parallel fashion to Jimmy and Rawls. So let's take a quick look at those two and see how they match up with Rawls and the other. So have another clip.
You can't play him out of that lobby. You can't take a beating either. So the first thing you do, you get all emotional. You pull your gun out. You do some dumb shit, and now we got to work around. Yo. You said one minute fucking thing I want to hear. Right. I mean, I gotta start thinking more. You be saying that all the time, and you're right. You can't play him out of that lobby.
So
you can't take a beating either.
I'm sorry, it's playing again, but that whole scene, right? Avon talking to D'Angelo in the same way Rawls is talking to Jimmy. Right?
Yeah, it's a rival organizations, superior, subordinate, dressing down because something went wrong.
It's really, I didn't think about that. And then you start seeing throughout the series all these intentional parallels, right? And rather than being in an institutional setting, this is in a strip joint. And that kind of comes with it with all the association and baggage and maybe quote unquote difference, but making the argument it's not that different. It's the kind of counter institution of drug dealing. With the war on drugs, that becomes big business. And you have to have rules, and you have to have hierarchy, and you have to have soldiers, and you have to be willing to kind of go to unbelievable extremes to get it accomplished. So I really love that scene, just the way it parallels.
There's some interesting photography going on in that. And I noticed in a lot of the night scenes, I don't know camera works so well to explain exactly what's going on, but they're using like a smaller depth of field with the lens, so Avon's in focus, but the things behind him are like totally blurred.
Absolutely.
You see it in the opening scene with McNulty and Snot Boogie. There's close-ups where lights in the background just like splotches, like abstract.
That's right. And you see Snot Boogie very clearly in some, and then they're splotched in the back, and vice versa.
Yeah, and it's I guess it's a visual storytelling technique that's emphasizing, that part of the scene, the person,
and your subject. And
kind
of really. And I was on a photo walk in Richmond recently, where my friend Tom Woodward, who's been doing stuff with this, was really focused on how do you do that as a visual style for him to kind of enable him to capture his subjects in different ways. And it's interesting because you start seeing that that's not just an effect apart from narrative in a way of telling stories. It actually is crucial to telling that story. And I think there's some great examples of that. I mean, you talked about, and that might be a good time to bring up that visual of how the actual frame tells a story beyond what's happening. Right? And how the frame can actually narrate in different ways. There's Weebay and D'Angelo where they're underneath that sign.
Right, this thing here. This is dealing with the same kind of thing. D'Angelo, in the previous scene, we saw that he was talked about as weak, or got all emotional. Should have done something different. So here's a discussion between these two, and they're like framed in this store window. And there are neon lights right above, Weebay on one side is burgers, above D'Angelo on the other side is chicken, and that really tells a story about their two characters. The thing I like about it is like there's a subtlety there to it, because if you're watching it, you're focused on the action, the people there, but you see that behind them, and that has an effect, and it tells you something, even if you're not directly looking at it or thinking about it. And that goes into that whole design thing as well. Everything that's in these shots, it's planned. Like, as we said, all the pieces matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think really, you sometimes, a lot of the stuff on TV and just a lot of the ways things are created, you either think of it as, oh, that's just shooting that, or it's just crap. But when you see something that is well wrought, like The Wire, and you see that there's these deep kind of narratives and subtext going on scene to scene, and paralleling stuff that's not just saying this shot will be like that shot, but this institutional relationship is like this kind of extra institutional relationship between two drug dealers. You start to see there's an argument being laid down for you to consider as a thoughtful person who deals with narratives and stories. And I think that's the art of The Wire that we'll be exploring for much of the next 15 to 16 weeks. And a couple of quick notes, and then we're almost out of time. We want to be religious to that 20 minutes. But one of the things that I was struck in season 1, or in episode 1, The Target, was the way in which they talked about another war, so to speak, or another kind of reality that's playing out. One that I'm really struck by in that close reading is the ability for people to, or for Simon to really comment on what's happening in the world. And this is the FBI.
It's one of the better CIs I've ever worked.
An interesting visual too.
That and more. Jesus Christ. Pretty fucking great, huh? How'd you get this on tape? It's not taped. It's live, brother. It's live. Live. A 3-story walk-up on Homer Avenue. To the bottoms of Pimlico. Is this going on right now? As we speak. How? Fiber optic lensing. Camera's behind a hole in the drywall. So small looks like a nail might have made it. What do you like? These motherfuckers sound great. 2 remotes behind the baseboard heating ducts. That's about $3K raw on the table today. We followed all the way from New York. You up in New York in this? We could be. We're backing into some Dominicans up there. Could have a Title III on them right now if we wanted. Wrong war, brother. Most of the squad's been transferred to counterterrorism. This thing's the last drug case we got pending. I gotta shut it down by the end of the month. You guys getting out of drugs? Yeah, for a while, yeah. We just don't have the manpower to say anything big. Since those towers fell. What, we don't have enough love in our hearts for 2 wars? Joke's on us, huh? I guess so.
I mean, there's a lot to say about that scene, but
Yeah.
the idea of the towers falling, this came out, a couple of months. This came out in 2002, so they were writing this at the end of 2001, early 2002. So, current event, something that's a historical event like 9/11, it's resonating, and the FBI moving their resources from the drug war to counterterrorism. Jimmy talking about we don't have enough love in our hearts for 2 wars, and the way in which the story at that point, for me, as early as episode 1, reached out to the global war on terrorism, and something that is deep to many of us as Americans or even as global citizens about what happened on 9/11 and what that meant for our sense of who we were, going to war in Iraq, you name it. The Wire interrogates that moment. Like, it doesn't let it go, and it keeps it there. I just found that really compelling as yet another moment where it's looking at not only the surveillance and these drug dealers, but the world in which we live in, and that shapes who we are. Because the actual choices of the world, like the narrative, are intentional. They're
Yeah.
shaping us.
Yeah. Yeah. And like as you mentioned, another thing that Simon mentioned in his commentary is they were actually like writing that before FBI pulled out and
Yeah.
moved everything to counterterrorism. Like he sort of took a gamble that was going to happen and put it into the story.
Yeah, he said there was like 10 to 12,000 agents available, and given that resources it would take to fight counterterrorism, there's no other way, or to do counterterrorism, there was no other way but to cut the war on drugs. And it also suggests to some degrees the notion of prioritizing, arbitrary relationships of wars, like war on drugs, and resources, and it just brings up so many other questions that, if you're a Reagan 80s kid like me, war on drugs was a moral reality. It had nothing to do with choices and, politics.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of sober.
Yeah.
It's great stuff. And then also there's that shot early on as they're walking into the FBI headquarters of the actual FBI building. And different visual, institutional, clean, like you said.
Well, you even saw it on the inside there that, I love that shot with the whole ceiling in there with the lines coming at you. The whole place looks clean, modern, there's money there. Whereas, as we'll see in the next episode, when they're given their own squad office, it's in the basement. It's a room that's not even being used, and
Yeah.
the police have to clean it themselves to make it habitable.
Yeah. There's constant work going on so they can't hear each other and the pipes are banging. Yeah, it's interesting. The final theme, and then we'll end this one, is the end of the episode. It kind of comes back to the scene where the person who had gone on trial, who basically was a witness against D'Angelo Barksdale for the murder, is on the witness chair, identifies him, and at the end of the episode, I guess a couple of weeks later, however much it is, he shows up dead. And that was kind of the first episode, right? Kind of clean, shows that he was real. I mean, D'Angelo has his own problems with the murder of that guy. But there's a moment, and it's the only moment in the series, according to David Simon, where they use flashback. And so I'm going to bring that up real quick, and then we'll talk a little bit about what Simon says about that idea of flashback. And it's kind of an interesting question that goes into, I think, something we've been talking about all the time, is this notion of intentionality and choices aesthetically when it comes to the rock. So let's take a look here and see what we got.
Case on the ground there.
Hey, buddy, do me a favor. Back up for me. So, call it in.
No, 21 pills found. So, William Gann, 42, 43 years old, had vessel stroke.
You got pictures?
Yeah, we got it.
Okay, let's roll it.
Mr. Gant, did you see the man you identified sitting in the courtroom today?
Yeah, so
He's right there.
there's that kind of odd moment where they have this flashback.
Yeah, because I had just watched the entire 5 seasons all the way through just a couple months ago with my wife, and as I watched that first episode again, that flashback shows up, and it is so entirely out of place within the context of everything that he's doing here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he says, in the commentary when you watch it, he's basically like, this is something HBO made them do. HBO said, look, your viewers are not going to remember that. You've introduced them to so many other characters. You're taking such a different approach. What might be called writing a novel over a season rather than discrete episodes. Right? So a very different aesthetic. And given that, they kind of pushed him at least for the pilot, to put in that flashback so that your kind of audience would remember him. there's this notion of pandering to the audience, and also, and Simon was back and forth. He said maybe they were right, but he didn't want to do it, and it kind of shows that even his own vision, has other influences on it, like HBO, the people who produce it, the people who give him money. The idea that HBO is doing this to make money, and that there's a whole institution undergirding the very making of the show as well. And I find it very interesting for him to talk about that, and then for it to kind of inform his aesthetic as well, even if he didn't want it.
Yeah, it's another nice parallel there, because the show's all about institutions, and then you've got that other institutional conflict behind it that impacts what he has to do in the show. Yeah.
It's really interesting, and I think it really gets to one of the things you see right away from episode 1, the first 60 minutes, is so many different aesthetic choices. We could only talk about a few in this video. It would be interesting for other people out there who are following along to think about some other aesthetic choices that people are making. Where does, The Wire, in terms of a cop show, break down? What are some other parallels that are going on? What are some other extra kind of moments that are happening in the now? Its ability to critique the now. And where are moments where you can feel the infrastructure of HBO or the TV mini, because that's a world too, kind of creeping in. Because I think Simon takes great takes great pride in the fact that this isn't a traditional TV show, and it's not. But it still has to follow a certain narrative arc that's framed and controlled by this notion of season. And he's working within that, but there's always limitations. So that's interesting, and maybe that's where we'll end this first discussion of Wire Season 1, Episode 1, The Target.
Yeah, good. All right.